April 1945, Neustadt an der Windowsill, Germany. The war was 3 weeks from ending, though nobody on the ground knew that yet. Towns were surrendering faster than American units could process them. German soldiers were appearing at roadsides with their hands up. Civilians were hanging white sheets from windows, and Patton's Third Army was moving so fast through southern Germany that supply lines were struggling to keep pace. Fuel trucks were being rerouted on the fly. Field kitchens couldn't always catch up with the men they were supposed to feed. Officers were sleeping 4 hours a night, sometimes less, and waking up to find that the front line had moved another 15 miles east while they slept. It was a strange kind of chaos, not the chaos of a battle being lost, but the chaos of a war being won faster than anyone had planned for.
Private First Class Ronald Garrett, 23 years old, from Knoxville, Tennessee, was part of a 4-man sweep team going house to house in a residential neighborhood that had been cleared 2 days earlier. He had been in Europe for 11 months. He had landed at Utah Beach as a replacement in June of 1944, joined a rifle company in Normandy, and somehow stayed alive through the hedgerows, through the breakout at St. Lo, through the bitter winter in the Ardennes, and now through the final push into Germany itself. He had stopped writing letters home in February, not because he had nothing to say, because he had too much, and none of it would fit on a single piece of paper.
Most searches turned up nothing. Hidden weapons occasionally. Nazi party documents sometimes. Food stores buried under floorboards. Now and then, a frightened soldier hiding in an attic, hoping to wait out the war in his own bedroom. The work had become routine. Knock on the door, announce yourself, walk through every room, check the cellar, check the attic, check the garden shed, move on to the next house, repeat. He hadn't expected what he found on the windowsill of a house on Brückenstraße. 3 watches, laid out in a neat row, catching the pale morning light. All different, all American military issue, all sitting in a German family's kitchen like they'd always belonged there. Garrett stood in the doorway of that kitchen for a long moment before he moved. He had seen a lot of strange things in 11 months of war, but something about the arrangement of those watches stopped him. They weren't hidden, they weren't shoved into a drawer or wrapped in cloth. They were on display, the way a person might display a small collection of objects they were proud of, or objects they had been told not to touch. Garrett called his sergeant. His sergeant called the lieutenant. Within 40 minutes, the report had moved up through channels and landed with a colonel who picked up a telephone. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. By the time Patton arrived at the house, the Bauer family was still at their kitchen table. Father, mother, 2 teenage sons, a daughter standing near the stove. They hadn't been moved or arrested. The Americans had waited. It is worth pausing here to understand what it meant for Patton himself to come to a house like this. By April of 1945, George S. Patton was one of the most famous soldiers alive. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine. His Third Army had advanced farther and faster than any army in modern military history. He commanded hundreds of thousands of men. His daily schedule was a constant negotiation between meetings, briefings, inspections, and the endless logistics of moving an entire army across a continent. For him to personally drive to a single house in a single small city because of 3 watches on a windowsill was unusual. It told you something about the kind of man he was and the kind of things he refused to delegate. Patton walked through the front door, scanned the room, and within seconds his eyes went to the windowsill. He crossed to it, picked up the first watch, turned it over, scratched into the metal casing on the back in uneven letters, CPL James R. Whitfield. He set it down. The second watch had no engraving but carried U.S. Army markings on the band. The third still had a piece of leather strap with a small metal clasp stamped T/5, the designation for a technician 5th grade, the kind of rank found in signals or engineering units. He held each one for only a few seconds, but anyone watching him could see he was reading them the way another man might read a letter. 3 American soldiers, 3 watches on a German windowsill. Patton turned to face the room. The father, Heinrich Bauer, was a man in his mid-50s, a former municipal clerk, according to documents the soldiers had already gathered. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his face arranged into something meant to look calm. He had been a clerk in the city's records office for 19 years before the war. He was not a Nazi Party member, according to the paperwork, though he had been required to attend certain functions in his official capacity. He was, by every available measure, an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary life in ordinary times, and now found himself sitting at his own kitchen table while an American general examined 3 watches that should not have been in his house. The father, Heinrich Bauer, was a man in his mid-50s, a former municipal clerk, according to documents the soldiers had already gathered. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his face arranged into something meant to look calm. He had been a clerk in the city's records office for 19 years before the war. He was not a Nazi Party member, according to the paperwork, though he had been required to attend certain functions in his official capacity. He was, by every available measure, an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary life in ordinary times, and now found himself sitting at his own kitchen table while an American general examined 3 watches that should not have been in his house. Sergeant Karl Mueller, Patton's interpreter, a German-American from Milwaukee who had been with Third Army since Normandy, stepped up beside him. Mueller was 34 years old. His parents had emigrated from Bavaria in 1910. He had grown up speaking German at home and English at school, and he had spent most of the last year translating in rooms exactly like this one. Kitchens, living rooms, bombed-out offices, prison cells, listening to ordinary German people try to explain the things they had done or the things they had failed to do during 12 years of a regime that had asked terrible things of them. "Ask him where the watches came from," Patton said. Mueller asked. The father answered in a voice that came out a little too evenly, like something rehearsed. "He says he found them on the road outside the city in February, debris from a military convoy. He says he didn't know it was wrong." "Ask him why they're on the windowsill," Mueller asked. Shorter answer this time. "He says his wife put them there, for safekeeping." Patton looked at the mother. She was a thin woman in her late 40s, hands pressed flat against her thighs, eyes on the floor. She had not looked up since the Americans had entered the room. Her hair was tied back in a way that suggested she had done it quickly, without a mirror. There was a faint tremor in her left hand that she was trying to keep still. "Ask her," Patton said. Mueller spoke to her directly. She answered quietly, without looking up. "She says she was keeping them to return them. She always intended to give them back." Captain David Loring, the officer running the sweep operation, had done his groundwork before Patton arrived. 31 years old, from Portland, Oregon, with a law degree he hadn't gotten to use before the draft. He had spent the months before the war preparing to take the Oregon bar exam. He had not taken it. He had instead spent the last 3 years learning a different kind of investigation, the kind that involved cleared villages, abandoned headquarters buildings, and questions that needed to be asked carefully because the answers mattered to people thousands of miles away who would never know they had been asked. He handed Patton a written summary when he arrived, and Patton had read it in the Jeep. 3 things established before he walked through that door. First, the Bauer family's street sat along the route German forces had used to march American prisoners from a collection point near Kaiserlautern to a transit camp east of the city in January of 1945. Multiple residents on the same street had confirmed this independently. A column of American prisoners had passed through Brückenstraße in the third week of January. 2 of those residents had described the column in detail. One had mentioned the men were in poor condition. Another had mentioned that the column had stopped for a time in front of the Bower house, though she could not say why. Second, Corporal James R. Whitfield, whose name was on the first watch, had been listed as missing in action since December 19, 1944, during the German offensive through the Ardennes. His family in Meridian, Mississippi, had received no confirmation of death or capture. His mother was still writing letters to the War Department every 2 weeks, asking for any new information. She had been writing those letters for 4 months. Third, hidden under a loose floorboard in the elder son's room, a United States Army-issue compass, the kind carried by officers and NCOs, the kind that didn't end up scattered on roadsides. Patton pulled a chair from the corner of the room, turned it around, and sat at the table facing the father. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand over the man. People who served under Patton sometimes said the most dangerous version of him was not the loud one. It was the quiet one, the one who sat down at your table and looked at you the way he was looking at Heinrich Bauer now. "Tell him I've been at this war for 3 years," he said to Mueller. "Tell him I've walked through Dachau. Tell him I know the difference between a man who doesn't know something and a man who's afraid of being caught. And right now, I'm looking at the second kind."
Mueller translated. Something shifted in the father's shoulders, barely visible. The kind of small physical change that happens when a man realizes the conversation he prepared for is not the conversation he is going to have. Tell him I'm not here to destroy his family. Those watches belonged to American soldiers, and their families deserve to know what happened to them. Then Patton turned to the mother. Ask her specifically, not where the watches came from. Ask her when she last saw American soldiers on this street, alive. Mueller asked. The woman glanced at her husband. He gave no signal. She looked back at her hands. Then she spoke for almost 4 minutes without stopping. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one.
Mueller listened carefully, made notes, and when she finished, he turned to Patton. "Sir, she says it was the 22nd of January. A column of American prisoners came through this street, 60 or 70 men, she couldn't be exact. German guards, 6 or 8 of them. The Americans were in bad condition. Most had no coats. Some were being half carried by the others. The kitchen was very still. The daughter, who had been standing by the stove since the Americans walked in, had moved without anyone noticing to stand closer to her mother. Her hand rested on the back of her mother's chair. When the column started moving again, 3 American soldiers couldn't stand on their own. The guards pulled 2 of them to their feet. The third one didn't get up. The guard who had knocked on their door came back. He took 3 watches from the American who couldn't stand, from his wrist and from his jacket pockets. Then he left the watches on her doorstep. She doesn't know why. Maybe he didn't want to carry them. Maybe he wanted them out of his hands before the Americans arrived. The column moved on. The soldier was left in the street. Mueller stopped. "What happened to him?" Patton asked. Mueller asked her. She answered very quietly. She says her husband and the older boy carried him inside. They gave him water and food. He was alive for approximately 2 hours. He died on their kitchen floor, in this room, on the 22nd of January. They buried him in the garden because they didn't know what else to do.
There was a long silence in the room, the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that fills a kitchen the way water fills a glass. Patton stood up from the chair. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden behind the house. Small,
maybe 30 feet deep, a low stone wall at the back. Near the wall, a section where the soil was a different color from the rest, the grass growing in a slightly different pattern, the kind of detail that a person walking past would never notice, the kind of detail a soldier who had buried other soldiers would recognize immediately. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned to Loring. "I want a graves registration team at this house within the hour. That garden is a burial site. Full protocol, careful excavation. This soldier goes home." "Yes, sir."
"And I want the name Whitfield cross-referenced against every prisoner transfer record from January. If that watch came off his wrist on this street, I want to know where he went after this column moved on."
"Yes, sir."
He looked at the family once more. Heinrich Bauer had his eyes on the table. His wife was crying without moving her hands from her lap. The elder son stared at the wall. The younger son, who had not spoken once since the Americans entered, was watching Patton with the kind of careful attention that children give to adults when they are trying to understand something they have not been told. "Tell them," Patton said to Mueller, "that what they did for that soldier, bringing him inside, giving him water, burying him, that mattered. Tell them that." He paused. "Then tell them the watches go with us, every one of them, and the compass." Mueller translated. The father nodded once without looking up. Patton walked out into the April afternoon.
The light outside was soft. Spring in the Rhineland that year had come late, but it had come. The trees along Brückenstraße were just starting to show green at the tips. A bird was calling somewhere, the kind of small, ordinary sound that the war had not managed to silence. Patton stood beside his jeep for a moment before he got in. He did not say anything to his driver. He did not need to. The graves registration team arrived 53 minutes later. They worked carefully, 2 hours in the garden near the back wall. They used hand tools, not shovels. They sifted the soil through screens. They did the work with the kind of quiet attention that the job demanded, because it was understood in that unit and in every unit like it that this was the last thing that could be done for a man, and it had to be done right. What they found confirmed everything the woman had said. One American soldier, early to mid-20s, in the remnants of an infantry field uniform from the fall of 1944. No dog tags, no external identification, but sewn into the inner lining of his jacket a small piece of cloth tape with a name and serial number in faded ink. Private First Class Thomas Garrett, from Altoona, Pennsylvania. 21 years old, listed as missing in action since January of 1945. Patton filed a separate note to attach to the identification report. It was not long. It said that Private Garrett had been given water by a German civilian family during his final hours, that he had been brought inside rather than left in the street, and that he had been buried with care. He believed the family of a dead soldier deserved to know every true thing about how their son had spent his last hours. He signed it himself.
Months later, in a small house in Altoona, Pennsylvania, an envelope arrived for a woman named Margaret Garrett, the soldier's mother. She read the note 3 times before she set it down. Then she walked to the kitchen, sat at her own table, and cried for a long time. She kept the note in her Bible for the rest of her life. When she died in 1978, her daughter found it still there, the paper soft from being handled, the signature still legible. The 3 watches moved through the Army's property recovery system. Corporal Whitfield's watch was the most traceable. Records showed he had been captured near St. Vith, Belgium, on December 19, 1944, during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive. He had entered the German prisoner system at a collection point near Prüm. After that, his trail dissolved into the chaotic paperwork of a collapsing military administration.
Investigators established with reasonable confidence that he had been part of the column that passed through Brückenstraße. But whether he was the soldier who had collapsed in front of the Bauer house or whether he had continued with the column was never resolved. He was officially declared killed in action in August of 1945. His watch was returned to his family in Meridian, Mississippi that fall. His mother kept it in a drawer beside her bed for the rest of her life. She wound it once a week, every week, until her hands could no longer manage the small motion. The third watch, the one with the T5 clasp from the 28th Infantry Division's equipment records, belonged to Technician 5th Grade Arthur Meeks from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Unlike Whitfield, Meeks had survived. He had spent 4 months in a German camp, been liberated in April of 1945, and was already in a military hospital in France recovering from malnutrition when the watch was recovered from the Bauer windowsill. When investigators contacted him to confirm it was his, he said yes, a guard had taken it from him at a transit point in January. He couldn't remember exactly where. He said he hadn't thought much about it since. He had other things to think about. The watch was returned to him before he shipped home. He wore it for the next 46 years. When he died in 1991, his son inherited it. His son still has it.
The Bauer family was not charged with any offense. Loring's investigation concluded they had not taken the watches themselves, had not participated in the mistreatment of prisoners, and had provided what help they could to a dying American soldier under conditions where refusing to cooperate with German guards carried real personal risk. The compass found under the elder son's bed was never fully explained, but in the absence of evidence connecting it to a specific crime, no action was taken. Loring sometimes thought about that compass for years afterward. He never wrote about it, but he mentioned it once, late in life, to a graduate student writing a thesis on civilian conduct in occupied Germany. He said he had decided, that day in the kitchen, that not every question needed to be answered. Some questions were better left to the family to live with privately. The compass might have been picked up off a road, the way the father had described the watches. It might have been something else. He had chosen, with the authority he had been given, not to turn over every stone. He said he had never regretted that decision. Patton never mentioned the house on Brückenstraße in his memoirs or his official reports. The incident was documented in Loring's files and in the Graves registration records, but it didn't make it into the public record during Patton's lifetime. He was killed in a car accident in December of 1945, only 8 months after the day he sat at the Bauer kitchen table. He never had the chance to write the kind of long, reflective memoir that some of his contemporaries produced. The Brückenstraße incident, like a great many things he did in those final months, lived only in the memories of the men who had been there. What did make it into the record, through the accounts of soldiers who were present, was something Patton said to his staff around that same period, in late April of 1945, when the question of how to handle recovered American property came up in a routine administrative briefing. His operations officer, Colonel Paul Harkins, recalled it years later. The briefing had framed recovered watches, dog tags, and personal items primarily as inventory matters. The discussion had been about classification systems, storage protocols, how to track items through the recovery pipeline. Patton listened for a few minutes, then interrupted. "A dead man's watch is not inventory," he said. "It is the last physical object that connected him to everything he was before this war. Our job is to get it back to the people who loved him. Every single one." Harkins said the room was quiet for a moment after that. The briefing continued. The classification systems were updated. But the people who were in that room remembered what he said, and they remembered it for a long time. The families of Whitfield, Garrett, and Meeks never met each other. They lived in different states, lost different men, received their notifications through different channels at different times. What connected them, without any of them knowing it,
was a windowsill in a German city, and a general who stopped walking when he saw 3 watches catching the morning light and decided that each one of them had somewhere it needed to go. Decades later, in 2003, a researcher working on a book about American prisoners of war in the final months of the European theater found a brief reference to the Brückenstraße incident in declassified Third Army files. She tracked down Margaret Garrett's daughter, who was by then in her 70s. She tracked down Arthur Meek's son. She tried to find descendants of Corporal Whitfield, but the family had moved several times, and the trail was harder. The book was eventually published in 2007. It mentioned the windowsill, the watches, and the kitchen in 3 quiet paragraphs near the back of the book. Most readers passed over it without noticing, but the people who knew. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.